Paradoxical. That's what we humans are when we claim we don't miss someone, yet find ourselves scrolling through their social media at 3 in the morning. What avoidance won't admit about missing you isn't just a simple confession of longing. It's a complex psychological dance that reveals the very architecture of how some people experience love and loss. You see, there's something rather fascinating about the avoidant mind, something that would make even the most seasoned behavioral psychologist pause and consider the intricate ways we protect ourselves from the very thing we crave most deeply. When I observe human nature, particularly in matters of the heart, I'm consistently amazed by our capacity for self-deception. The avoidant individual represents perhaps the most compelling paradox in attachment theory, a walking contradiction who simultaneously yearns for connection while building elaborate fortresses to keep intimacy at bay. They won't admit to missing you, but their behavior tells an entirely different story, one written in the subtle languages of delayed text responses, carefully calculated indifference, and the peculiar way they remember exactly what you wore 3 months ago while claiming they've barely thought of you since. The illusion of transparency plays a crucial role in this emotional theater. Avoidants believe their feelings are far more obvious than they actually are. They assume that their internal struggle, their late-night thoughts of you, their momentary softness when your name appears on their phone, is somehow radiating from them like heat from a furnace. They think you can see right through their carefully constructed walls, that their longing is written across their forehead in bold letters. This misconception leads them to build even higher walls, to become even more distant, because they're convinced they're already revealing too much. Equally fascinating is how the spotlight effect influences their behavior. They believe everyone around them is acutely aware of their emotional state, that their friends, colleagues, and family members are all secretly analyzing their every move for signs of weakness or vulnerability. This imagined scrutiny creates a performance of indifference that becomes increasingly elaborate. They craft social media posts designed to show how unbothered they are, engage in relationships that seem strategically positioned to demonstrate their emotional independence, and develop an almost theatrical commitment to appearing unaffected. But here's what they won't tell you, what they can barely admit to themselves in those quiet moments before sleep claims them. They notice everything. They know exactly how long it's been since they last heard your voice. They remember the way you laughed at their jokes, particularly the ones nobody else seemed to find amusing. They've mentally rehearsed conversations they'll never have with you, arguments they'll never win, reconciliations they'll never initiate. They miss not just your presence, but the version of themselves they were when they were with you. The person who could let their guard down, who could be seen and known and still feel safe. The truth is, avoidants don't just miss people differently, they miss people defensively. Their longing comes wrapped in layers of rationalization, minimization, and strategic forgetting. They'll tell themselves they miss the convenience of your relationship, the reliability, the practical benefits, anything but the deeper truth that they miss being vulnerable with another human being. They've convinced themselves that admitting to missing someone is equivalent to admitting defeat, surrendering their independence, revealing a weakness that others might exploit. What makes this particularly poignant is that their silence on the matter of missing you isn't evidence of not caring. It's evidence of caring so much that the feeling threatens their entire sense of self. They've built their identity around self-sufficiency, around the belief that needing others is dangerous, that emotional dependency leads inevitably to disappointment and pain. To admit they miss you would be to acknowledge that their carefully constructed worldview might be incomplete, that connection might be worth the risk, that love might be stronger than their fear. Throughout history, literature and psychology have grappled with this fundamental human contradiction, the way we simultaneously reach for and retreat from the very experiences that give life meaning. The avoidant represents this struggle in its most concentrated form, a person whose heart beats with the same rhythms of longing as anyone else, but whose mind has learned to translate that longing into a language of distance and denial. Understanding this translation, learning to read between the lines of their careful indifference, requires patience, wisdom, and perhaps most importantly, the recognition that sometimes the deepest feelings are expressed not through words, but through the elaborate lengths we go to avoid saying them. Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect I once knew who could design buildings that would stand for centuries, but couldn't construct a relationship that lasted more than 18 months. Marcus had perfected the art of caring without appearing to care, of missing people while maintaining the fiction that he was perfectly content in his solitude. After his relationship with Sarah ended, he spent months crafting elaborate explanations for why he was better off alone, why her departure was actually a relief, why he could finally focus on his work without distraction. But Marcus had a peculiar habit that betrayed his true feelings. Every Tuesday evening he would drive past the small cafe where he and Sarah used to meet for coffee. Not stopping, mind you, just driving past, always with some practical excuse, some errand that happened to take him through that particular neighborhood. When friends noticed this pattern and gently teased him about it, Marcus would become visibly agitated, constructing increasingly complex justifications for his route choices, citing traffic patterns and construction delays, anything but admitting the simple truth that he missed her and couldn't quite let go of the places they'd shared. The most telling moment came 6 months after their breakup, when Marcus ran into Sarah's sister at a gallery opening. Without any prompting, he launched into a detailed account of his recent successes, his new projects, his busy social calendar. But in the middle of describing his latest architectural commission, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked, with a casualness that fooled no one, "How is Sarah doing, by the way?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with unspoken longing and carefully concealed vulnerability. What Marcus couldn't see, trapped as he was within his own perspective, was how transparent his feelings actually were to everyone around him. His friends had noticed his Tuesday drives. His family had observed his inability to mention Sarah's name without a particular tension creeping into his voice. His colleagues had seen how he'd grown quieter and more withdrawn despite his claims of newfound freedom. The illusion of transparency worked in reverse for Marcus. While he believed his feelings were glaringly obvious, he simultaneously convinced himself that his performance of indifference was Oscar-worthy. Sarah's sister later told me that she'd wanted to tell Marcus that Sarah missed him too, that she'd asked about him multiple times, that she'd driven past his office building with the same desperate casualness that characterized his Tuesday cafe routes. But the spotlight effect had convinced both of them that their feelings were so apparent, so embarrassingly obvious, that they needed to overcompensate with increasingly elaborate displays of moving on. They became performers in a play neither wanted to be in, each convinced the other could see through their act, while simultaneously believing their own performance was flawlessly convincing. The tragedy of Marcus and Sarah's story isn't that they couldn't make their relationship work. It's that their fear of appearing needy or vulnerable prevented them from having the honest conversation that might have helped them understand what went wrong. Marcus's avoidant tendencies convinced him that admitting he missed Sarah would somehow diminish him, would reveal him as weak or desperate. He couldn't see that his careful indifference was actually more transparent than honesty would have been, that his elaborate avoidance strategies were broadcasting his feelings more clearly than any declaration of longing ever could. I remember another case, a woman named Catherine who'd ended things with her partner of 3 years because she felt suffocated by his emotional needs. Catherine prided herself on her independence, her ability to thrive in solitude, her freedom from what she saw as the messy complications of deep emotional attachment. She spoke eloquently about the relief she felt, the peace of coming home to her own space, the joy of making decisions without consultation or compromise. But Catherine had developed an interesting relationship with her phone. She would place it in another room when she was home, claiming she needed to disconnect from the digital world, to be present in her own life. What she couldn't admit, even to herself, was that she was avoiding the temptation to text him, to check his social media, to reach out in moments of weakness. Her phone had become a symbol of her own vulnerability, and keeping it at a distance was the only way she could maintain her carefully constructed narrative of contentment. The most revealing moment came during a dinner party when someone mentioned her ex-partner's name in passing. Catherine's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her entire body went still for just a fraction of a second, and then she overcompensated with an almost aggressive change of subject. Later, when pressed by a close friend about her reaction, Catherine became defensive, explaining at great length how little her ex-partner's life meant to her now, how rarely she thought of him, how completely she'd moved on. The very intensity of her denial revealed the depth of feelings she couldn't acknowledge. What Catherine didn't realize was that her friends could see through her performance, that her family worried about her increasing isolation, that her colleagues noticed how she'd grown more rigid and controlling at work. The spotlight effect convinced her that everyone was watching her for signs of weakness, so she became increasingly vigilant about appearing strong and unaffected. This hypervigilance created a feedback loop where her behavior became more and more obviously defensive, drawing exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. These stories illuminate a fundamental truth about avoidant attachment. The very strategies people use to protect themselves from emotional pain often create more suffering than the vulnerability they're trying to avoid. The energy required to maintain the illusion of not missing someone, to police every thought and feeling and expression, is exhausting in ways that genuine grief or longing never could be. Now, if you recognize yourself in these stories, if you see your own patterns reflected in Marcus's Tuesday drives or Catherine's hidden phone, there are practical steps you can take to break free from this exhausting cycle of defensive longing. The first and perhaps most crucial step is developing what psychologists call emotional awareness, but I prefer to think of it as emotional honesty. This begins with creating space for yourself to feel whatever you're feeling without immediately rushing to judge or change those feelings. Set aside 10 minutes each day, perhaps in the morning with your coffee or in the evening before bed, to simply check in with yourself. Ask the question, what am I actually feeling right now? Not what you think you should be feeling. Not what would be convenient to feel, but what's actually present in your emotional landscape. If you miss someone, allow that feeling to exist without immediately constructing elaborate explanations for why that missing is irrational or counterproductive. The goal isn't to wallow in these feelings, but to acknowledge them with the same matter-of-fact acceptance you might bring to noticing that you're hungry or tired. This practice of emotional honesty extends to recognizing the difference between missing someone and wanting to act on that missing. You can acknowledge that you miss an ex-partner without immediately reaching for your phone to text them. You can admit to yourself that you think about someone often without interpreting that as a sign that you need to reconnect. The feeling and the action are separate things, and learning to hold space for the feeling without compulsively acting on it is a crucial skill for anyone with avoidant tendencies. The second step involves challenging the cognitive distortions that fuel avoidant behavior. The illusion of transparency makes you believe that your feelings are far more obvious to others than they actually are. To counter this, try an exercise I call perspective taking. When you're convinced that everyone can see how much you miss someone, ask yourself, if my best friend were behaving exactly as I am behaving, would I assume they were missing their ex-partner? Often, you'll realize that what feels glaringly obvious from the inside is actually quite subtle from the outside. Similarly, the spotlight effect convinces you that others are paying far more attention to your emotional state than they actually are. Most people are far too absorbed in their own lives, their own dramas and concerns, to spend much time analyzing your behavior for signs of lingering attachment. This doesn't mean people don't care about you, but rather that they're not conducting the kind of intensive surveillance of your emotional state that the spotlight effect suggests. Recognizing this can be profoundly liberating, freeing you from the exhausting performance of being perpetually unaffected. The third step is perhaps the most challenging, learning to communicate your feelings directly, even when those feelings make you feel vulnerable. This doesn't mean you need to pour your heart out to everyone you've ever missed, but it does mean practicing the skill of emotional honesty in lower stakes relationships. Start with friends or family members, practicing the simple act of saying, "I miss you" when you do, or "I've been thinking about you" when that's true. Notice that the world doesn't end when you reveal these feelings, that people often respond warmly to genuine expressions of care and connection. As you become more comfortable with small expressions of vulnerability, you can gradually work up to more significant ones. If you're missing an ex-partner and genuinely believe there might be value in reconnecting, consider reaching out directly rather than engaging in the elaborate dance of indirect communication that characterizes so much avoidant behavior. This doesn't mean you should profess undying love or demand immediate reconciliation, but you might send a simple message acknowledging that you've been thinking of them and wondering how they're doing. The fourth step involves developing what I call tolerance for uncertainty. Avoidant individuals often prefer the known discomfort of missing someone in silence to the unknown outcome of expressing those feelings directly. But uncertainty is an inevitable part of human relationships, and learning to move forward despite not knowing exactly how others will respond is crucial for developing more secure attachment patterns. Practice sitting with the discomfort of not knowing, of taking emotional risks without guaranteed outcomes. This tolerance for uncertainty extends to accepting that relationships, even good ones, involve some degree of messiness and complication. The avoidant tendency to prefer the clean lines of solitude often stems from a fear of the unpredictable nature of human connection. But this unpredictability is also what makes relationships rewarding, what creates the possibility for surprise, growth, and genuine intimacy. Learning to see uncertainty as an exciting possibility rather than a threat to avoid requires practice and patience with yourself. Finally, consider working with a therapist who understands attachment theory and can help you explore the roots of your avoidant patterns. These patterns often develop early in life as adaptive responses to particular family dynamics or circumstances. Understanding the origins of your attachment style can help you recognize when you're responding to current situations based on old fears rather than present realities. Therapy can provide a safe space to practice vulnerability and develop more secure ways of relating to others. The journey from avoidant attachment to more secure patterns isn't about suddenly becoming someone who wears their heart on their sleeve or who can't function independently. It's about expanding your range of emotional expression, about developing the flexibility to move between solitude and connection as circumstances warrant, rather than defaulting to isolation as your primary coping strategy. It's about recognizing that admitting you miss someone isn't a sign of weakness, but evidence of your capacity for meaningful connection. What I want you to understand, what I hope these stories and strategies have illuminated, is that the very fact that you're watching a video about what avoidants won't admit about missing people suggests you're already on a path toward greater emotional honesty. The recognition that missing someone while pretending you don't is exhausting and ultimately counterproductive is the first step toward developing healthier patterns of attachment. The avoidance secret isn't really that they miss people, it's that they believe missing people makes them weak, that needing others compromises their strength, that love and independence are mutually exclusive. But the most genuinely independent people I've known have also been the most capable of deep connection. They understand that true strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, that real self-sufficiency includes knowing when and how to rely on others, that authentic freedom includes the choice to commit and attach and risk being hurt. If you recognize yourself in Marcus's Tuesday drives or Catherine's hidden phone, if you've ever spent more energy pretending not to miss someone than it would have taken to simply admit your feelings, know that change is possible. It requires courage, the same kind of courage that helped you survive whatever circumstances taught you that distance was safer than closeness. But this time, that courage can lead you toward connection rather than away from it. The next time you find yourself missing someone, try this. Instead of immediately constructing elaborate explanations for why that missing is irrational or inconvenient, simply acknowledge it. Say to yourself, or even to them if appropriate, "I miss you." Notice that the world doesn't collapse, that admitting to feelings doesn't diminish your strength or independence. Practice seeing vulnerability not as a weakness to be hidden, but as a bridge toward the kind of authentic connection that makes life meaningful. Your patterns of attachment developed over years, perhaps decades, and changing them won't happen overnight. Be patient with yourself as you learn new ways of moving through the world, new ways of balancing solitude and connection, independence and interdependence. The goal isn't to become someone different, but to become more fully yourself, to access the full range of your emotional capacity rather than limiting yourself to the narrow band of feelings that feel safe to experience. Remember, the people worth missing are often the people worth reaching out to. The relationships worth grieving are often the relationships worth fighting for, and the feelings worth hiding are often the feelings most worth sharing. Your capacity to miss someone deeply is evidence of your capacity to love deeply, and that capacity, however carefully you've hidden it, is one of the most beautiful things about you.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.